Washte. Hello, everybody. For those of you that haven't seen one of my other videos, my name is Scott, and I've been making videos based on a course that I had the incredible gift of an opportunity to moderate, really is the best way to put it. Last year when I was teaching at University College of the North in Northern Manitoba. And it was a class that was built as a response to the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And really what it was an open space for everybody in the class to talk through pieces of the true history of Turtle Island and different pieces of the relationship between Indigenous communities and the colonial government in ways that nobody seems to have had the freedom to do before. And I thought that what I would do is make these videos as a starting off point for people to use to go to sources that have far more knowledge on all of the points that we're talking about, but this kind of gives a starting off point. So to begin, I would like to acknowledge that since we are coming together virtually, we are really coming together across the traditional territories of the more than 630 different Indigenous communities that hold space across Turtle Island. That we're grateful for all Indigenous peoples who continue to care for and remain interconnected to the lands of Turtle Island. Miigwech, Nakramik, Newin, for knowing that our ongoing survival is connected to the land deeply. And today I would just like to take a few minutes to talk about some of the experiences that are unique to Inuit communities across the circumpolar north of Turtle Island. Because the fact is that experiences in the Arctic are different than in southern Turtle Island. The myth is that things were easy because they weren't, they aren't, and they will continue to not be in ways that we occasionally hear about in the news, some of which are also experienced in the south, such as unhealthy water and unsanitary living conditions. For instance, you may find a house with up to 17 people living in a 2-bedroom unit that's covered in mold. That is not uncommon in the sedentary communities across the north that are a direct result of the colonial impact on Inuit communities, which, as some people may know, have traditionally been nomadic, meaning that communities in the Arctic did not live in one place throughout the year. In fact, they traveled with the caribou migration, as it was for many communities is the main source of the staple diet. And while I was living in the Arctic, I had the opportunity to experience the caribou migrate through our community, and it was an incendiary experience. And I can only imagine the beauty and the sense of self that existed when a community was able to live nomadic and travel with the caribou throughout the year. And part of why that no longer exists is, well, in fact, the entire reason that it no longer exists is due to the colonial government imposition and forced sedentary lifestyle for Inuit communities, meaning they were essentially forced into staying in one spot and abandoning the traditional ways of life and ways of living that make sense in the Arctic. And part of how that happened was through the murder of the Qimmit. And what's a Qimmit, you may ask? I'll show you, because there happens to be a retired Qimmit sharing space with me. There she is. Her name's Yuri. So she's a retired Qimmit. Qimmit are sled dogs. They're often hybrid with wolves, is at least my experience. This one is very docile, but the Qimmit were the companions to communities. They were essential and coexisted as part of the community and let the sleds. And part of how the colonial government was able to force a sedentary lifestyle on Inuit communities was by slaughtering the Qimmit, essentially making it impossible to continue with a nomadic way of life as there were no more sled teams. And that has been questioned by the colonial government, as many things that we talk about are, but primarily in the 1950s and 1960s, this was a very common practice. And part of why Indian agents were able to get in the same space as the sled teams and kill the Qimmit en masse was that as Inuit children were forced into residential schools in the north, and that's another myth, that there were no residential schools in the north. There actually were from between the 1860s and the 1990s. But as Inuit children were forced into the northern residential schools, their families would stay close by. They would not set up a sedentary life. They kept their sled teams, but they would stay close. And that meant that they were close enough that the Indian agents were able to slaughter the Qimmit. And so that brings out one of the other aspects of Inuit and colonial relations, was that there were also residential schools in the north. One of the other things that was unique for Indian Inuit communities in terms of their relationship with the colonial government was in relation to tuberculosis hospitals or Indian hospitals. And these were hospitals where Inuit who were potentially infected with tuberculosis, or who it was argued by Indian agents were testing positive for tuberculosis, were forced into these hospitals thousands of kilometers down south. Forced into a plane, forced to the hospital. If they survived, once they were released from the hospital, they were not helped back to their community and to their family. They were just released from the hospital and forced to fend for themselves in this new world on Turtle Island, where they knew nobody and had no resources. And if somebody did not survive in the hospital, or even if they did, nobody in the hospital was communicating back to the family and to the community in the north. So there was no way of knowing if your relative had survived or had died. If they died, there was no information shared with where they were buried or what had happened to their body. And if they survived, there was no knowledge shared about that either. And it's not like you could just hop on a plane and fly down, because flying from the Arctic is very difficult nowadays. It certainly was not often a possibility 50 or 60 years ago. Another thing that I wanted to address was the number tagging system. In an attempt to strip Inuit communities and individuals of their identity, Indian agents forced Inuit members of the newly sedentary communities across the north to be assigned by a numbered tag. And so what these would be are small leather medallions that an Inuit individual would be forced to wear either around their neck or around their wrist. And if they were caught without this on, then that was an arrestable offense, that was a crime. And on one side of these leather coin size medallions, there was the number assigned to this individual, and on the other side there was an insignia for the government. And another aspect that I wanted to briefly talk about was the forced relocation to the far north. And this was a program that largely in the 1950s, I believe between 1953 and 1955, was when the government forcibly moved individuals and families from communities in northern Quebec, Nunavik, the region that our new Governor General is from. Shout out to Ms. Simon, congratulations. But where it was a time when individuals and families were forced from their sedentary community in Nunavik up to the far north. And the idea of north and far north can be somewhat relative. So I'm going to share my screen just to show you a map very briefly to give some context of what this concept of near north and far north would be. So as you can see, Inukjuak is in the Nunavik region of northern Quebec, and families were forced far north to communities like Pond Inlet, Resolute Bay, and Craig Harbor. And when families were forced up into these far north regions, they were promised that there would be opportunities to hunt and live nomadically again, and that there were resources, so it would be possible to survive and possibly even to thrive. And what communities found when they did get to these locations was that that was not the case at all. It was not sustainable to live in these communities. There were no resources to build any type of protection from the incredible cold. There were very few resources to hunt, and those that did exist were listed as endangered species. So the Indian agent that had accompanied these communities that were being forcibly formed in the far north made it a criminal act to kill these, to hunt these very few resources that existed. And so while communities did eventually find a way to survive, and there are still small communities in these far northern locations, it was a situation where there was a great deal of pain and a great number of very tragic and painful deaths that were entirely forced upon by the colonial government. And so I really just wanted to take a few minutes to share some of the unique experiences of Inuit communities as a starting off point. And I think I've rambled on way too long. So thank you, Miigwech Nakrumik, for taking some time to share this space with me. And I wish you a good journey as you move forward on your personal path towards reconciliation.